we thought we'd start by just saying welcome. We're so glad that you took a little time out today to spend some time with us. It's such a beautiful day outside. I hope you got some sunshine as well, but we feel honored that you would sacrifice a little bit of your sunshine to, except for those of you who are watching from outside, to just learn a little bit about mindfulness with us. And we wanted to introduce ourselves. So I'm Tracy Ochester. I'm the Heart-Mind Coordinator for Midwest Alliance for Mindfulness, which means basically I just do the needful. And we have a great staff of 13 teachers. Erik is one, who help make us what we are, and also a wonderful community of people who just practice mindfulness, who come to our offerings and events, who also are such an important part of who we are. I'm also a psychologist in private practice, but this is what I'm spending most of my time doing these days.
Erik Hulse here. I one of the teachers at I teach community practice classes and some other things, and I teach MBSR, or mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is one of our 8-week courses at MAM. I am a retired police officer, so I retired from the Overland Park Police Department about 4 years ago, and I spend a good deal of my teaching time also dedicated to teaching mindfulness to first responders, police officers, firefighters, and soldiers under the MAM flag, and also for a couple of other organizations. So very, very happy to be here to talk to you about mindfulness today.
Thank you, Erik. So what is mindfulness? Well, I think that's a huge question because it's a word that's been used quite a bit from everything from product sales to the kind of thing we're doing is teaching people skills and practices to, mindful wine drinking and mindful, I've even heard of mindful mayonnaise. So it can be pretty confusing what this word mindfulness means. And that's why it's so important for us to help you get clear about that so that you really understand the spirit of what mindfulness is. And Midwest Alliance for Mindfulness did our best to kind of collectively come up with a definition that we felt was a little easier to understand and also captured the intention behind what we're doing in the community. And our definition is mindfulness is a way of living developed through a variety of practices that helps us bring kind and non-judgmental attention to moment-by-moment experience, giving us the choice to respond in ways that support health and well-being for ourselves and our communities. But I think it's best to understand mindfulness through direct practice. So along these lines, Erik is going to lead us in a brief mindfulness practice so that you can get a taste for it. Know that throughout the 2 hours today, we will be offering you various practices, and that these are just invitations that we encourage you to participate if you'd like. If you're not comfortable, don't feel like you have to, you can just listen along. And also if at any point during the practice, a particular guidance doesn't feel appropriate for you or feels really uncomfortable, know that you're welcome to do what you need to do to care for yourself. You can stop following the guidance, you can get up and move around, take a break, whatever it is that you need to do to listen to your own needs and take care of you.
Thanks, Tracy. So yeah, as Tracy pointed out, one of the wonderful things about mindfulness meditation is its accessibility. Certainly this is just an invitation, but there are some of the obstacles that people have identified as preventing them from starting a mindfulness practice have to do with this concern about doing it right, sitting right, breathing right, and all these kinds of things. And finding a position that allows you to balance comfort and alertness. So just comfortable enough to remain relatively motionless for a few minutes, but not so comfortable that you get tired or sleepy. And that's the right position. So maybe feet flat on the floor or legs solidly on the floor, hands on the legs, or fingers interlaced together. Sitting upright, perhaps imagining a string extending from the top of the head to the ceiling or to the sky. Not too stiff a back, but just upright. And then either closing the eyes, or if that's not available or comfortable to you, maybe just softening the gaze. Just hooding the eyes a little bit, maybe looking down on the floor or the ground a few feet in front of you, just to reduce the potential distractions. Just settling into that space and becoming aware of the sense of the body in space and the points of contact between the body and the floor or the chair. And then maybe just taking a few slightly longer than normal breaths, a little bit bigger than normal. Perhaps taking the air in through the nose for a count of 3 or 4, and then exhaling just a little bit longer, maybe to a count of 5 or 6. Just bringing some relaxation to the body and the muscles, and allowing the tension of the day to just release a little bit. Settling in, letting gravity do what it does. Maybe doing a brief scan from the top of the head to the bottoms of the feet, allowing the tension to release intentionally from each part of the body, maybe out of the brow, maybe in the jaw, allowing for there to be some space between the teeth, allowing the shoulders to drop down and away from the ears, allowing for some softness in the chest and the belly. Then allowing the breath to return to normal. Our body has been breathing itself successfully for our entire lifetimes. So we can just allow it to do so here and now. Not trying to control it, just allowing the breath to return to its normal pattern. And then just bringing awareness, or this state of curious observation, from the breath to the sounds that we hear in our immediate environment. There are sure to be sounds around you, within or without the room that you're in. Some subtle, some very noticeable. Maybe even inside your own body. And then as these sounds become more prominent in your field of awareness, just rather than figuring out what they are or naming them, just noticing their qualities, the volume, maybe the duration or the distance or the pitch. Are the sounds loud or soft? Are they nearby or far away? Are they constant or intermittent? Perhaps even noticing the various layers of some of these sounds. And in mindfulness meditation, what we endeavor to do is to become simply the observer. Not judging, in this case, the sounds to be pleasant or unpleasant. Just making note of the sounds and their qualities. And then perhaps if judgments do arise, simply observing those judgments, or opinions or thoughts or feelings with respect to the sounds. Perhaps you're sitting in a room or a space.
So I'll take over for a minute because it sounds like
Normal.
Erik's audio was out for a moment there. You want to return to your guidance, Erik? I just heard you.
Okay. Just settling into these sounds now as they present themselves without judgment. And if a thought or an image or an emotion arises, simply observing that, gently but firmly returning the attention back to this awareness of sound and beginning again. In these last few moments, either staying with awareness of sound or perhaps returning to the sensations of the body or the breath. Just resting in this hopefully more spacious, present moment awareness. And on your own now, perhaps bringing a little movement back to the toes and the fingers. Slowly opening the eyes as this practice closes. In all of our classes, when we lead meditations, or for that matter, give a lesson or recite a poem or what have you, we do something called inquiry. And the reason we do that is because for many people, various things come up during a practice that can lend themselves to being processed or talked about, or something about which they have a question. We also recognize that in every group of meditators, there's an enormous wealth of experience and wisdom, and it's just useful to the group too to engage in this process of inquiry, whether you speak or not. But it's always a good opportunity to sort of process what came up during a meditation and answer questions and ask them as well. So in that spirit, if anybody would like to share perhaps what they noticed in the body or in their experience during this meditation, or maybe comment on how it might have been different from your usual way of being, or if you've discovered anything in particular, or even have a question following that mindfulness of sound practice.
I have attention deficit and hyperactivity, so I have to be doing something so I can stay still. And therefore, I'm all over the place, and it's such a difficult thing to keep me. I wish I could put harness on me and guide me and nail me to a place.
Yeah.
So meditation has always been very, very difficult, but this time, in order to pay attention, I have to draw. Where I push out my movements, I'm drawing, and then I can think, I can listen. Mm-hmm. But it was, I don't know why, but maybe it was your voice or the way you were talking. I suddenly was drawn into that. Mm-hmm. And I don't know why. It doesn't happen like that.
Do you normally meditate with guidance or without?
I have tried everything. With videos, with audiobooks, and it's very difficult.
Yeah.
The only way I have found I can follow something that I want to, I have to translate it into another language. And then I really attention. And that's how I became interpreter. A side benefit, but that was the only way.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you mind if I mention something?
Yes.
Because there are so many great things that you brought to light there, Margarita. First of all, mentioning the ADHD. So as you know, that's a very common diagnosis, and we get a fair number of people who have frustrations around that very issue. I'll say that even if you don't have ADHD, it's very challenging for most people when they first start to find stillness. So I think a lot of people can relate to that, but it can be extra challenging if you have ADHD. And instinctively, you discover that there are some things that can help, like having some movement during the practice helps you focus your attention. So many people who have attention difficulties may decide to do a movement practice in the beginning, especially as they're learning to, to kind of gather their attention more and more. The interesting thing is we have more and more research that says that a mindfulness practice can help actually strengthen attention even in people with ADHD. So I'm glad that you keep at it, even though it can be frustrating, because there are benefits that you can gain even if you have ADHD. And what people find is that over time, they are able to get greater and greater amounts of stillness. Yeah.
There's hope.
Yes, there's hope.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. I mute myself, okay?
Okay, sounds good, Margarita. Anybody else by a show of hands have a little trouble finding stillness? Yeah, there's a lot. Yeah, it can be quite a challenge. Yeah.
Yeah, and for those of you who are new to meditation, there's something, a term that we use is typically referred to as anchors, and the sound is just being one of those anchors to which we can return when our attention or emotions or thoughts or images sort of take our attention away. And so there's a variety of anchors, bodily sensations, the breath, sound, even visual cues and things like that. So many of us also find from day to day that one or more of those anchors tend to be more or less accessible to us in the moment, and just easier to sort of tether, so to speak, our attention to, as thoughts and emotions tend to hijack our awareness. So that's another little tip that folks find helpful.
Erik, yes, I wonder also if Margarita might have found it a little easier because it was about sounds. We notice a lot of times with new meditators that mindfulness of sounds is more accessible than just paying attention to your own breath or the thoughts in your head. And so you might experiment with that a little bit. Like on a beautiful day like today, there can be wonderful sounds like bird song and children in their yards and the sound of the wind in the trees. And I don't know, sometimes we discover that there's more there than we thought there was going to be. Did anybody have that experience where even there in your own home that you're probably in a million times, or in your yard that you're in a million times, did anybody notice anything new? Wanda, it looks like you did. You see your mute button? Yeah, there you go. Perfect.
There was a time where, just starting out with this, when I would hear something, I would totally just buy into the distraction.
Mm-hmm.
It's still different. It's very different to focus on the distraction and grow from that. So that's, to me, it's gotten so much better where I'm not letting them be irritants, and so it's pretty cool.
Yeah, very well put. Very well put.
Yeah. It's like you're saying, you let go of the struggle. If there's something that keeps pulling at you, why not just let that be the object of your attention? Yeah.
Yeah, this is Ray.
Hi, Ray.
Howdy. Yeah, I appreciated Wanda's comment on distractions and having to learn how not to make it an irritant. And I quickly got focused on the bubbling sound from our aquarium, from the aerator, which is kind of a nice sound. But unfortunately, in the land of pristine lawns, there's a guy out here with his leaf blower as usual. And unfortunately, it brought up my extreme aversion to that noise. And I appreciated Wanda's comment that maybe, and part of my interest in mindfulness is to learn how to transgress beyond the irritant level to maybe ignoring it or accepting it or whatever. So anyway, it's good to see everybody here, and that was just my one comment.
Yeah. Boy, I bet there's a lot of people here that can totally relate with that. And fortunately, that's something we're going to be talking about, is that it really does help a lot with what you're calling irritability. We might call reactivity, where little things can kind of get under your skin. And sometimes it takes a little practice, but sometimes when you start to feel some stability in your practice, you can actually explore those irritants a little bit, and there can be some interesting things you can discover in that exploration. But there are times when the irritants are so powerful that it's discouraging to you, and then you may need to switch the focus of your attention, just to help yourself kind of have that kind of courage and motivation to keep going forward and not make it into a torturous practice for yourself. Anything you want to say about that, Erik?
Yeah, so I would only add that especially when talking about irritants and those things that are the source of as Ray called it, aversion. Very well said, Ray. Another obstacle, like I was talking about earlier, that some people have to meditation is that they think it's predicated on sort of numbing ourselves out and becoming sort of just inactive, sort of inert in an ethical sort of way, and not doing anything about those kinds of irritants, which in some cases do represent problems that need to be solved. And so mindfulness meditation, really quite the opposite, allows us to have the kind of clarity that we need to solve the problems in our lives without that reactivity sort of muddying up the windshield, if you will, and making it just that much more difficult to solve those actual problems. Because of course, mindfulness meditation doesn't make our problems go away. However, it can provide us that balance and that clarity to go out and solve the problems in such a way that things like anger and resentment and frustration and anxiety don't get in the way. So mindfulness of sounds is especially when you're hearing things that don't always bring up pleasant feelings, is a good sort of doorway into practicing those skills on the cushion, so to speak.
Well, what do you think about going back to the next slide and talking a little more in depth about what mindfulness is? First and foremost, mindfulness is a way of being. It's a way of living our lives. It consists of some attitudes that we cultivate, some traits that we develop, and traits are kind of enduring qualities, and also states that we're able to fall into when we need them. So for example, a state of calm and balance, even in a difficult situation. So a lot of times when people think of mindfulness, they think of the practice that we just did, which is meditating. But meditation is only one formal practice of mindfulness. It's one that gets emphasized a lot because it is important and useful. But there are actually many, many formal practices. And then there's also integrated mindfulness, which is the mindfulness we take into our everyday lives. And that's the ultimate goal. Our practice is kind of like a gym where we develop our muscles of mindfulness so that we can go out into the world and be stronger in those skills. Because let's face it, it's a lot harder to be mindful in our everyday lives where there's all these challenges and distractions than it is to be mindful in a little quiet spot, sitting in a comfy chair without any interruptions, although that's challenging enough as it is. So when we practice mindfulness, whether it's on the meditation seat, whether it's during yoga, a formal practice like that, or whether it's just in our daily lives, it's how we practice that's even more important than the tools we use for practicing. And the how of practicing mindfulness is the kind of attitude we bring to our practice. These include things like non-judging. So during your meditation that you just did, you probably noticed that your mind made all kinds of little judgments, right? Judgments about the sounds that you were hearing. And judgments don't always mean that you're thinking something's bad. You can also judge something as good or pleasant. There were probably also maybe some judgments of yourself, right? How you were doing this, whether you were doing a good job of it or not. We make little judgments all day, every day. And it's an important thing that we do that because we have to make decisions in our daily lives. That's how we survive. But the thing is, we're so good at it that sometimes we forget that it can be useful to set aside those judgments so that we can gather more information before we, sometimes we decide prematurely before we have all the information. Another attitude that we cultivate is patience. This is not only the patience that we develop for ourselves, needing to start again and again every time we get distracted, coming back to our object of focus, but also we begin to be more patient with the experiences in our daily lives and the other people that we interact with. Trust is a big one. We learn to trust ourselves and to trust our practice and to trust experience to unfold in the way it needs to, so that we can respond in a way that is discerning, that comes from a place of wisdom. And also things like gratitude and compassion and generosity. These are all attitudes that naturally develop when we practice mindfulness, but they're also attitudes that we can adopt as we practice. We can purposefully adopt them. We wanted to talk with you a little bit about the science of mindfulness, because, you know, we believe that the true proof is in your own practice, but we also greatly value science. We like to see some evidence behind the things that we intuitively experience ourselves. And fortunately now there's more than 40 years of research behind the practices of mindfulness. And there's several things that have been consistently and reliably shown to be correlated with a mindfulness practice. And one of those things is decreased levels of stress. Who couldn't use that? Fortunately, we have many, many studies that show that indeed, when people practice mindfulness, also their stress levels come down. Also, you can imagine just from doing that little brief meditation that we did together, that it increases our self-awareness. That's because we're getting quiet and paying attention to what's happening inside us. And by doing that, by understanding ourselves better, we can make better decisions in our lives about how to respond. Improved emotional regulation. So we learn about our emotional patterns and habits, our triggers, the things that tend to set us off, and the kind of signatures of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that tend to come with our emotions. This, once again, allows us to make better decisions about how we respond to our emotions rather than just reacting to them. We've also found that there's a reduction in symptoms in a number of mental health conditions in people who practice mindfulness, including anxiety, depression, and even addictions, cravings and addictions. There's also a correlation with physical health, a reduction in chronic pain, and heart disease. positive changes in risk factors that might lead to serious chronic ailments. There have been some studies that show decreased blood pressure. And this, as we know, high blood pressure can lead to a number of health problems if unchecked. If you're curious about the specific research behind mindfulness, we have a huge bibliography of as many research studies as we've been able to collect and read. And that's on our website under the resources link. And you're welcome to browse them there.
Sure. So on the subject of science, we, in mindfulness education, whether we're teaching individual classes or the more in-depth 8-week mindfulness-based interventions, we think it's very useful and important to use science to, as Tracy said, to illuminate or illustrate the benefits of mindfulness. Not so much to turn anybody into a biologist or a neuroscientist or anything like that, but as Dr. Krista Neff says, Dr. Neff is one of the leading researchers in mindfulness, in particular the effectiveness of self-compassion. She says science gives our thinking brain explanations for why we feel how we feel, reduces the self-blame and shame, and creates motivation to create new habit patterns. So we think science can be a very effective door into mindfulness for people who either don't know much about mindfulness or have some skepticism around the idea of meditation. And as teachers, we take very seriously our responsibility to share the scientific studies without overhyping it. As Tracy mentioned earlier, the term is just so ubiquitous, and there are many, many people out there making claims for mindfulness that just really are not supported by the science. And so we take a very modest and humble approach to it so that it serves an understanding of mindfulness. And then we allow practitioners and students to simply decide for themselves what's important to them. If, like us, you're a science nerd or a mindfulness nerd, like to read books, a really terrific book that describes sort of the state of mindfulness study is called Altered Traits. Tracy used that term with respect to mindfulness, and it's Altered Traits by Daniel Goleman, who wrote the book on emotional intelligence, literally, about 20 years ago, and his co-author Richard Davidson, who's one of the leading contemplative neuroscientists in the world. But Altered Traits does a really nice job of just kind of talking about the state of research on mindfulness. So Tracy, if you'll go to the next slide, you'll see and again, not trying to turn anybody into a neuroscientist here, but rather just in very broad strokes, describing a little bit about the brain, how it functions, and the impact that it has on our levels of stress and emotional reactivity. As you can see here, and as you probably know, the brain has evolved over many, many, many millennia. And roughly speaking, as it evolved in 3 fairly distinct stages, the first of which is what's often referred to as the reptilian brain, located on this diagram at the bottom. And it's the lowest part of the brain, the first to evolve. And what's useful to know about that is that it's responsible for the functions that everything we can do when we're born. Okay, so when we're first born, we can sleep, we can eat, we can cry, we can breathe, and we can eliminate waste. And that's just about it. There's not a whole lot of empathy or cognitive thought going on at that point. Secondly, the mammalian brain, where the limbic system is located, often referred to as the middle brain, developed, and that's the part of the brain that we share with animals who live communally and who nurture their young. This part of the brain supports long-term memory and emotions, and it initiates protective responses such as fight, flight, and freeze, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and I'll talk about here in just a few moments a little more deeply. And then that top larger part of the brain, the neocortex, often referred to as the rational brain, that's the part of the brain that separates us from the rest of the animal kingdom. It allows us to use language, to engage in abstract and creative thought, to empathize with others. And we think it's very key also to recognize that it's the part of the brain that allows us to make choices based on an imagined future. So in other words, to think about events that have not happened yet and to plan for them, to prepare for them, but also to worry about them, to ruminate, to think backwards to events that have happened in the past and to carry regret, stressful thoughts about them as well. So the key difference with respect to this rational brain between humans and animals is that while animals may know, humans know that they know. And it's that reflective thought, that capacity to think about events that have either already happened or haven't happened yet, that really distinguishes us from the rest of the animal kingdom. So in the next slide, the last brain picture, I promise, it shows us three other key areas in the brain. And the first is the amygdala, those two little shapes at the bottom and to the left of the illustration. And the amygdala is very, very key. It's referred to by neuroscientists as the body's smoke detector. So it's located in the limbic area of the emotional brain. And its central function is to assign emotional interpretations like pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral to information that comes in through our senses. And it identifies what's most relevant to our safety and our survival. And so perceived threats result in a signal being sent down the brainstem to release stress hormones, to activate a whole body response. And so what's really key to understand about that in the context of mindfulness is that we're talking about
We lost you for a second there.
we are talking about, what was I saying? We're talking about an involuntary reaction to stress response. So that's really the bullseye here to understand. And then the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex play important roles having to do with memory and informing the rational brain about the time sequence of events. The prefrontal cortex is located in the rational brain right above the eyes. And it helps us to understand what is happening, to plan for events in the future and to make decisions about the best path forward. And under ideal circumstances, that prefrontal cortex is what keeps the amygdala or the emotional brain in check.
So you stopped at keeping the emotional brain in check.
Process between the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, and the amygdala gets and often remains out of balance for extended periods of time. So we keep responding as if a threat is still taking place. Now, there are very few people in our population who have not either endured or been around trauma, primary or secondary exposure to trauma. And so this explains for us, this helps us to understand why it is that even though our rational brain understands that a threat is not taking place, our response to it is still consistent with this felt experience of being under threat. So if the stress levels are high enough, then those stress hormones will actually disable the hippocampus and prevent it from accurately recording the chronology of the event. So the rational brain never gets the message that the traumatic event has ended, and it fails to inhibit the emotional response.
So Erik was talking about post-traumatic stress there. That part got cut out.
Oh yeah, sorry. So in post-traumatic stress, for any part of it that you might have missed, what happens is this integrated process gets a hitch in it. In other words, based on trauma from the past, we keep responding as if a threat is still taking place. The stress hormones continue to circulate in the body, which causes these survival-based emotional reactions to cycle, sometimes indefinitely or extended periods of time.
So one of the main reasons people seek out mindfulness training, and that's definitely true for our center, one of the main reasons people come to our center is because they feel stressed out. And they've heard, accurately so, that for many people, practicing mindfulness can help alleviate stress, help modulate it. So stress is the state of emotional or mental strain or tension that results from adverse or demanding circumstances. And there was a great survey by the American Psychological Association in 2019 called the Stress in America survey that said that half to 2/3 of Americans experience physical or emotional symptoms of stress, often with negative consequences to individual health as well as costs to the broader community. And I think right now there has to be, I mean, I would imagine that it's nearly universal right now with all the uncertainty and the changes and the difficulties that we're experiencing with the pandemic and the stay-at-home orders. So what happens is mindfulness doesn't get rid of stress. What it does is it changes the way that we relate to our experience. It changes the way we perceive things, and it changes the way that we respond to things, so that our reactions to disturbing emotions are transformed without us having to reject those painful emotions. So many of the things that we instinctively do in our day-to-day lives are to push away these difficult emotions. We numb ourselves out, we distract ourselves, we get super busy, we get overly focused on things outside of us, and we just try to ignore or get away from these painful feelings. But mindfulness gives us a kind and gentle way for us to approach these difficulties so that we can actually take care of ourselves and respond to them in ways that are likely to be useful. So almost all animals possess very similar threat processing circuitry that helps us survive and live long enough to reproduce. But especially in humans, luckily, we have this thinking part of our brains. It's not just instinct, which means that we have to make interpretations and that we can have choice around those interpretations. Mindfulness practice helps us both on the biological level and also on the cognitive or the thinking level. So before we end for a break, we thought we would guide you through another just very brief little practice. So finding, once again, a posture that feels nice and supported. Maybe the soles of your feet are on the ground, or if you're sitting on the floor, just really feeling like your seat is supported by the surface underneath you. Finding a place that puts your hands that feel relaxed, and letting your shoulders relax down your back, feeling the crown of your head uplifted, and finding where you'd like to place your eyes. Maybe you'll close your eyes or maybe just take a soft gaze. And once you find this relative stillness of the body, maybe experimenting a little bit with finding an anchor, something that helps you be aware in the present moment. For some people, this is noticing your breathing. But for some people, noticing the breath isn't very anchoring. It can be unpleasant, or it can just be very subtle and hard to notice. So you might experiment instead with noticing the soles of your feet or your seat on the cushion. And seeing if you can really get in close, get curious about it. What's really going on there? Are there some physical sensations that you're noticing? Is there a sense of temperature? Is there tingling? Is there a feeling of pressure? Maybe several of these things going on all at once. If you're noticing the breathing, is there a rhythm there? Is there a pause between the in-breath and the out-breath? Does the air feel different when it comes into the body than when it leaves the body? Maybe it's cooler or warmer. And each time your mind wanders away, which it will do a million times, just seeing if you can treat it very gently, maybe with a sense of humor, and guide it back to your particular anchor. Just exploring. And then on the out breath, letting go of attention to your anchor and expanding awareness out, now to include the sounds in the room, maybe opening the eyes a little wider, noticing visual stimuli. And then we'll release this brief practice. And just like we did before, just spending a few moments, if you would be willing, in sharing anything that you noticed.
I found that the liberty or the freedom to choose anything, like the feet, and anchoring and giving permission to select whatever I wanted, which in this case was my heels and my balance. And I noticed that one foot is, I think, is shorter than the other, one leg. So that I was able to continue focusing instead of the breath and empty brain, know nothing of the brain, because it has always been impossible.
Yeah. I'm so glad you mentioned that, empty brain, because I think a lot of people get this idea or get this message somewhere that we're supposed to empty our heads. And in my experience, what really happens is that your thoughts kind of start to go back into the background. So it's not like thoughts completely disappear, although maybe some like really advanced, monks or something have completely empty heads. But, as long as our brains are living, there's some kind of processing happening. And so I like to think about it as just kind of being in the background, kind of like, if you were looking at a painting and there was a boat in the foreground and you really paid attention to that, but you could still see the water and the sunset in the background. It's still there, but it's just not the focus of our awareness. And then that allows us not to kind of have this like real striving with ourselves to achieve some state that, just might not really be achievable for us. Instead, it's just experimenting with what's available. And some days the feet may be really available. Other times the breath is, other times hearing might be, and really giving yourself permission to experiment with building the muscles of attention, whatever way is accessible for you. So knowing that it's really, when we're starting, it's so difficult. I think I spent the first 2 years only being able to really manage maybe 10 minutes. Yeah, yeah. And it was really tough. And I did a lot of yoga, which is a movement practice, and that helped me a lot to learn how to be more still. And often I would do a yoga practice. I still do a yoga practice before I sit to meditate, because then a lot of the excess energy is out of my body, and I've developed a mind state that's a little calmer, and then the stillness is more accessible. So this all just, nobody told me to do that. It just was what I discovered for myself, and it will be the same for you all. Thanks for sharing that, Margarita. Any other noticings about this practice?
I'll jump in. So for me, every time I do a meditation or even a movement one with yoga and everything, it helps me remember that I'm normally a shallow breather. And so when I do anchor and focus on my breath, I will notice my breath elongating throughout the time, the longer that I can do it with all of my distractions, because I'm one of those people that can't shut off my brain, that always thought that that's how meditation had to be. I had to clear it out, had to sit still. And I found, honestly, through yoga and the continuation of practice. So if the first time it's an hour and I could only focus for little increments, you know, and focus on that. But then as I continued on with my practice, I was able to get through an entire session of yoga focusing solely on yoga and to celebrate that win for me. So for me is I will notice the beginning of each practice, I have really shallow breaths again, and I'm not taking those good full breaths for myself, and I know that I feel it. And as it elongates just kind of naturally without really forcing it, the end, I'm like, oh, I feel so much better. I feel that the blood is where it's supposed to be and my brain feels better. And so the breath is always great for me.
Some really great observations. One, a beautiful example of patience, right? Really having patience for yourself in the beginning and being okay, accepting that there just may be fleeting moments of stillness and that was okay. And with that patience, you noticed you were able to have more and more stretches of time where you were calm. And also this just wonderful insight about yourself that, oh gosh, when I'm on autopilot, I'm breathing shallow. And when I breathe shallow, it's like this for me. So then when I breathe more deeply, things seem to be more easeful for me. Can I just be aware of that at different times in my life? Yeah. And I love that observation because I think that there's so many of those moments when you practice mindfulness, so many of the things you notice in your practice, you have the realization, oh my gosh, this is what's happening in my real life. That all these things I'm encountering as I'm practicing are actually habits I have in my day-to-day life as well. And you start to experiment with new ways of being that also start to ripple out into your actual life. Thank you for sharing that, Rachel. You may have noticed during that practice, maybe not, but maybe so, some of you may have noticed that your breathing may have deepened or become more subtle, or that your body became a little bit more relaxed. And what we find is that a practice of mindfulness tends to help us learn to regulate our nervous system a little better. And why that's important for lots of reasons, but one of the main reasons is, as Erik mentioned, when we're in that fight, flight, or freeze mode, it's really hard for us to access our thinking brain so that we can actually have choices around things and not just be dragged around by our strong emotions or our instincts, which sometimes may be helpful, like if you're about to get hit by a bus and you need to jump out of the way, but at other times actually are a little bit too knee-jerk, and we're not considering the subtleties of a given situation. I don't know if some of you are familiar with Dr. Daniel Siegel's hand model of the brain. So you saw our picture of it, but he also has this kind of hand model where the brain stem is kind of in the palm and wrist, and then the mammalian brain is in the thumb, and then it's all wrapped and covered by the higher brain, the thinking brain, the cortex. When we encounter a stressful situation, what can happen is our more primitive parts of our brain take over, and what he says is we flip our lids so that what's really in control now is this mammalian part of our brain and the reptilian part of our brain. And instead of being able to think through things, we're just responding on this instinct, which unfortunately isn't always the best way to go about things. So a mindfulness practice helps us access helps us calm our nervous system and access that thinking brain so that we can have choices and make decisions.
Okay, so as you can see here, we have a slide that illustrates the nervous system, and it's broken down into the parasympathetic and the sympathetic side. And as you perhaps browse down the lists on either side, you'll see various body parts, organs, systems that have very important but different, or actually opposite, functions, whether we're under stress or perceived stress or not. So for instance, the sympathetic nervous system, which is which is referred to often as the sort of the accelerator. It mobilizes this fight or flight response. You'll see on that list that things like the pupils dilate, the heartbeat increases, the bronchial tubes are dilated in the airway, and other certain kinds of functions like the digestive system will decrease their activity as a result of those not being essential organs or processes to aid in our survival. So this fight, flight, or freeze response is based on whether or not the sympathetic or the parasympathetic nervous system, which is referred to as the brakes of the system, or the rest and digest part, is activated. And again, really the thing to keep in mind is, as Tracy hinted at earlier, is that these responses are involuntary. We can't choose, while we can certainly choose our actions and our responses to stressors, we can't necessarily exert very much, if any, control over our emotions. And so being able to access that higher functioning part of our brain and our nervous system is always going to be to our benefit. And mindfulness meditation gives us methods and strategies with which we can get that access and step out of autopilot.
That's a wonderful segue. So you'll often hear this phrase in mindfulness training, that mindfulness helps us learn to step out of autopilot. And autopilot's that thing that happens like when you drive to the office or drive to a place that you've been a million times, and it's almost like you don't even remember the drive there. You just suddenly arrive, and it's because your body is just kind of functioning in this kind of zone of kind of a place where you've wired your brain so well doing this task over and over again that you've made a groove for yourself, and you hardly even have to pay attention at all. The problem is that sometimes there's new information that's coming up that we're not attending to when we're on autopilot. And so this actually narrows our choices. Sometimes we're operating on expectations or biases or beliefs that may not be grounded in fact. And we can get ourselves in trouble if we're just responding in this kind of rote way, inflexible way to most of the situations that we encounter in our daily lives. So there are some changes in the areas of the brain that manage emotion and memory that we've noticed in people who practice mindfulness. So there's this circuitry in the brain called the default mode network, the DMN, and it's active when we're kind of thinking about the future and thinking about ourselves, self-referencing, comparing, making judgments, thinking about the past. And these are important functions that we need for survival, but oftentimes we spend way too much time in doing mode. We can get stuck in them, and this is a problem when people suffer from depression or anxiety, worrying so much about the future or regretting the past, being overly self-critical, self-judging, or other judging and blaming. And what mindfulness does is help us get better at shifting between the default mode network and something called the task positive network. This is being mode, and this is the network of the brain that's online when we're focusing our attention on the present moment, like when you're in flow. Those creative types, when you're in the flow and it's like your thinking brain isn't really online, it almost feels like you're the muse is there and you're being inspired. Or maybe even people who play sports or people who run might find this kind of mode where you're just flowing. You're just really in the moment. You're not thinking about the future. You're not regretting the past. And this happens when we meditate on the breath or body sensations or any of the senses. And with repetition, we learn how to be more flexible about moving between these two modes. Sometimes it's better for us to just be. Sometimes we need to let go of the doing.
And back to the science a little bit on that that subject of the default mode. One of the well-known studies that was done on that subject had to do with taking the study group. The researchers would send a number of text messages to the respondents at various times during the day, unannounced, just random times of the day, and when the participants would receive at various times of the day, and finding to their surprise that more often than not, folks were in some kind of a mind wandering or daydreaming mode, and when they were comparatively less happy. And so this idea that daydreaming is always this creative, happy mode is a little bit belied by the fact that when our minds are wandering, we aren't necessarily, we're certainly not in the present moment to that degree. If we're thinking about things in the past or the future, we're often less satisfied with our present moment.
Erik, I'm going to repeat a little bit of what you probably said because you cut out. But
Okay.
what he said was that that they would receive text messages throughout the day asking them, what are you doing and what are you thinking about? And what Erik was, and then how happy are you? And what Erik was going to mention, what he might have heard that part where a lot of times their minds actually weren't on what they were doing. And when their minds weren't on what they were doing, they were more likely to say they were less happy.
Exactly. Thank you. Am I a little more clear now?
Yes.
Okay, good. So this next slide about paying attention, one of the well-known operational definitions of mindfulness that comes from Jon Kabat-Zinn, who created mindfulness-based stress reduction and is sort of considered the maybe the wellspring from which most contemporary mindfulness training comes. His definition is that mindfulness is the awareness that arises from paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. So this idea of paying attention is sometimes conflated with awareness, and within mindfulness, we do make a distinction about awareness being a more universal, sort of encompassing state of being, whereas attention requires some degree of intentionality. So attention is an executive function and is found to be enhanced in experienced meditators. It gives us the capacity to choose where to place our focus, to sustain it there, and to shift it when it's appropriate. For instance, when an anchor needs to be changed during meditation. And so you may have noticed, for instance, in the sound meditation or the mindfulness of sound, that perhaps you paid closer attention and you noticed some things you never perhaps had noticed before. And that's by virtue of bringing some calm, quiet, clarity to the moment and applying that attention in a way that is concentrated and it is focused, but it's not overexerting. So it's this distinction between allowing something to happen by being rather than making it happen and achieving those higher levels of attention than we thought might be possible. So attention is this moment-to-moment experience that gives us potentially more accurate information about our internal states, about the external environment, and the interactions between the two. Mindfulness practice is correlated with enhanced sustained and selective attention, as well as intentional control. And with more and more practice, we're better able to essentially shift our attention to where it's most beneficial and to sustain it there, even when, as we've already talked about, distractions are present and kind of conspiring to pull us away from the present moment. So having access to that really important information allows us, one, to make better choices in responding to those situations. And it also helps us to make wiser decisions about how we can best care for ourselves when we're feeling stressed or depleted.
So mindfulness also helps us expand our window of tolerance. And the window of tolerance is this kind of sweet spot, this zone in which we're still able to function even though we might be under a high level of arousal. So we're still able to think rationally and make good decisions, even though we might be experiencing some kind of difficulty. And actually, arousal can even be really good stuff, right? Like, you can imagine how you felt if you won the lottery. It might kind of send you over the deep end in a good way. And it's hard for us to stay present and function when our emotions are just out of control. So this practice of mindfulness, through helping us better regulate our central nervous system, to understand ourselves and our emotional responses and how to help ourselves with those emotional responses, we start to feel more trusting of ourselves, and we start to feel more confident in being able to face lots of different situations. You'll hear in mindfulness circles in the training how people feel like they have more courage to face difficulty. And that's not that it's infused in you somehow by mindfulness practice. It's more that through experience and through paying attention, you just start to realize that more things are workable than you once understood. And you start to tap into these kind of inner resources that maybe you hadn't paid attention to. They'd been there all along, but you really hadn't explored them or exercised them. These are all some benefits of practicing. A lot of times we spend so much of our energy trying to avoid things that we're afraid of, or trying to fight against them, being really vigilant and defensive, when we don't sometimes need to do that. Sometimes we do, but there are a lot of times when we're expending that energy unnecessarily, and that energy could go into so many more beneficial things if we had that to, I think mindfulness practice makes us a little bit more efficient. And you can imagine if you're able to direct your attention where you want it to go, how much more of what is really important to you, you'd be able to attend to. Most of our teachers, I think all of them now, are trained in trauma-sensitive mindfulness. We have learned how to identify when somebody might be having a trauma response and to help them work with it mindfully. And some things that we teach people in teaching them mindfulness is this kind of permission that you heard in the last meditation, that really you can trust yourself to find within yourself where that anchor is, that place where you can feel safe and stable. Sometimes people direct you to the breath in these guided meditations and apps, and the breath might not be the right place. So you learn that you don't have to listen to that you can trust yourself and find your own anchor. And also you can learn to broaden your attention so that you're not so laser focused in on something if it's feeling overwhelming, and learn to shift your attention to what feels good in this moment, what feels safe, where we feel loved, where we feel connected, something that gives us a sense of well-being during those times when otherwise we might kind of be moving outside our window of tolerance. And also some other things that can help is changing your posture, standing up, having some movement, opening your eyes. Lots of different things we can do when we feel overwhelmed. We start to trust ourselves to care for ourselves in a beneficial way so that we can start to meet difficulty with greater calm and ease. Erik, I want to tell you that I cannot access the chat while I'm in these slides. So if you see some chat things coming up and you have a moment, it would be great if you'd be able to address them.
Okay, sure. And could I just make one comment on the, with regard to the last slide?
Yes.
When we think about the definition of mindfulness, by definition, mindfulness and meditation is this process by which we really reorient ourselves sometimes towards troublesome emotions, emotions like anger, anxiety, resentment, or what have you, that we have often typically created ways of avoiding or suppressing or what have you. And so it's extraordinarily valuable in terms of facing those emotions. At the same time, as Tracy mentioned, some of the more traditional approaches to mindfulness meditation might lead one to believe that that it becomes sort of this mind over matter sort of thing, where no matter how troublesome that emotion is, how afflictive it is, you're supposed to just stand pat, keep the eyes closed, and continue to focus on your breath, even if it's not particularly neutral, as Tracy mentioned earlier. And that's not really the case. That really is kind of runs counter to the idea of healing oneself and nurturing these more adaptive ways of dealing with emotions. So really, mindfulness meditation isn't about gritting your teeth and sweating through even the most troublesome emotions if that's not possible for you. So that's why it's so important to recognize that these, what we call permissions for overload, for instance, can be utilized to kind of navigate those more troublesome emotions, and not necessarily a reason to stop meditating, but rather to modify or modulate your meditation practice in such a way that it actually serves you rather than makes these problems harder.
Yeah, thank you for adding that, Erik. Did you want to launch into cognitive flexibility, or would you like me to?
Go right ahead.
Okay. So it's interesting that, when we're on autopilot, we can get pretty rigid because we just fall into these kind of default ways of being without much thought. So mindfulness, interestingly, opens up this space where we can be more flexible. And often that leads to greater ability to adapt to change. We notice more of what's happening, and including our own internal response. And that gives us more choices. So there's a saying that I love about like a willow tree bends and doesn't break. And so mindfulness gives us this flexibility where we still are solid, we still have our roots, but we're able to move and bend when difficulty and challenges arise in such a way that we don't break. And it's quite helpful in building resilience in that way. So you'll notice as you practice mindfulness that you tend to become less of a black and white thinker. We start to see more in depth all the complicated things that come together to make things arise. And that these things are often very workable, that there's often more than one way to approach a difficulty. So we're less likely to get stuck, and we're more able to switch gears. Sometimes this is called set shifting, and that's the ability to move back and forth between tasks or operations or even mental mindsets in response to changing demands. Also, there's this quality called divergent thinking. Divergent thinking is correlated with creativity. And this is where we're able to explore many possible solutions. This is in contrast to convergent thinking, where we're trying to find the one correct solution to a problem. And you can imagine with many of the problems that face us as humans and in our environment and in our society, how it's so important to be able to think divergently, to think outside the box. Also, we found in the research that people who tend to be more mindful rely more on an insight approach to problem solving. And this is where there's just this like sudden discovery or recognition of a solution rather than going through this step-by-step analysis of the factors. Creative thinking often involves this kind of insight aha moment that happens for people when they're faced with a problem. And interestingly, being able to tap into this insightful part of ourselves is also related to this ability to to shift between being mode and doing mode. When we're locked into doing mode and we can't shift naturally back and forth like that, it makes it harder for us to come up with creative solutions. Anything that you wanted to say about cognitive flexibility, Erik?
You know, I would just, as a very quick testimonial, I would point out that as a retired police officer, I certainly came out of a line of work in which there was a lot of struggle between divergent and convergent thinking, and coming out of police work and having that intuition towards the more convergent side. I would say that being open to and kind of cultivating a capacity to see different options as potentially equally viable in day-to-day work, but certainly within my relationships as well, was profoundly useful. Whether you're in a line of work that's akin to police work or not, you may very well find that sometimes convergent thinking makes sense, but it's nice to have access to a slightly more flexible mode of decision making as well within the work context, or, like I said, personal relationships as well.
Yeah. Personally, I feel like my creativity took a big hit when I went to graduate school. And there was just so much analytical thinking that was emphasized. And since I began my own mindfulness practice, I've just found I feel more inspired to do creative writing and do all kinds of different creative projects at home, which was something that I lost touch with, probably since I was a young child. So it's a pretty delightful side effect of practicing mindfulness. So decentering, to me, the easiest way to describe decentering is we are not our thoughts. And even though that might sound pretty logical, I think in our day-to-day lives, before we're terribly aware of our own inner experience, we don't realize that. We walk around as if our thoughts are us, that we're completely fused with them, and it's impossible for us to step outside them and see them for what they are, which are just, all kinds of phenomena happening in the mind. When you sit quietly and start to pay attention to the thoughts that come through your mind, it can be pretty eye-opening. There's all kinds of thoughts in there that are random and have nothing to do with anything. And some of them are just scary stories you tell yourself for no good reason. Some of them are just daydreams. But when we're fused with our thoughts, we can pretty easily get caught up in those scary stories. And then we get into a vortex of strong emotions unnecessarily that can cause us a lot of pain. So the ability to observe our thoughts and emotions rather than being caught up in them gives us space to examine the facts of a situation more closely and to choose a more appropriate response. If we feel like our thoughts are inseparable from reality, then there are many times when we're going to have less choices in the decisions we make. You can see this every day out in the world, people reacting to certain beliefs they have without evidence and creating problems for themselves and other people. So this is no authority telling us what to think or what to feel. Rather, we're just taking a look back at our own thoughts and feelings and deciding for ourselves what's wise, what's useful. So a nice metaphor is a traffic metaphor. Maybe you could tell that one, Erik.
Sure. Yeah, so we use metaphor quite a bit in mindfulness. It can be an extremely useful way to just sort of illuminate various ideas and help us apply them to principles to our practice. So one great way to practice this idea of decentering is if you think about being this observer that I mentioned in the earlier practice, sitting on a bench next to a busy highway, for instance, and there's an enormous amount of traffic barreling in both directions right in front of you, and thinking of that traffic as these thoughts and these emotions and these checklists and these frustrations and these anxieties that are barreling through our mind during the day. often out of control, and understanding that we have a choice in terms of how we interact with those thoughts, which aren't us. And the choices really are either to sit on the bench, to acknowledge the presence of these thoughts and emotions, and to watch them dispassionately and maintain that clarity of mind that we were talking about earlier. And the other choice is to jump out in the middle of traffic and try to stop it, try to redirect it. And we all know what the outcome would be if we tried that in real life. So to simply acknowledge that if we sit on the bench and acknowledge, not try to ignore or suppress those thoughts, but to acknowledge them and allow them to do what they're going to do anyway, which is come, stay for some period of time, and then go. It's a much healthier way to live, and an easier way to make decisions about the things that really, really matter.
Yeah, I think it also helps us take things less personally. Sometimes when we're caught up in our thoughts and feelings, we find ourselves kind of referencing everything back to ourselves. We ask ourselves, what does this have to do with me? What does this mean about me? How is this going to affect me? And so then things feel really personal that aren't always very personal. An example of this is, imagine for a moment that a colleague or a friend insulted you. You know, maybe they called you stupid or something like that. How would that feel in your body? And what thoughts and feelings would come up around that? And then imagine that instead a 3-year-old did that to you. How would that feel? And what makes it different? Right? If a 3-year-old did this to us, we would be able to make space and pause and consider around that, because we are able to see this as the innocence of a child. But if our colleague or friend did that, probably we would get caught up in the moment, making all kinds of stories about what that really meant about us and our relationship with them and our future with them. And then we'd be caught in this spiral of emotion that would expend our energy and cause us some pain that maybe didn't need to happen. We could instead maybe take some space, pause, and address it in a way that could be more useful for us if we were able to do some decentering. We already talked a little bit about emotional regulation. So in thinking about the time, maybe we won't spend a ton of time on this, but you know, when you think about school children, how important it is for them as they grow and develop to be able to be aware of their emotions and adequately relate to them and respond to them, and also for them to understand how other people feel and how other people might feel if we do this or that, and to have empathy for other people. All of this helps us be kinder and behave in a more pro-social way, which is not only better for us, but also better for our communities, better for the people that we encounter. And this ripples out in a much broader way when we're able to make these good decisions about the emotions that are happening inside us. That has ripple effects for everybody. Anything you wanted to say about emotional regulation, Erik?
Yeah, I think just going back to that the example that you just gave, Tracy, of a colleague saying something insulting to us versus a 3-year-old. You know, through mindfulness practice, we become aware of those inner experiences, or even referred to as maybe thunderstorms. Noticing the connections between our thoughts and our feelings and our sensations and our urges, and just step back from them to view them more objectively. So in that sense, emotions can be used as useful signals, very useful, important signals, rather than indisputable facts per se. So if my colleague says something insulting to me, there's still a problem there, right? That's useful information for sure. But to the extent that I can refrain from allowing my immediate knee-jerk reaction to guide my response, I can go a long way towards preserving our relationship and actually identifying the source of what he or she said, and moving on in a more productive way. So it's not to deny that words have meanings, but rather to keep some perspective on whether, to what extent they mean what they seem to have meant when they were uttered.
You might be seeing how all of these things, all of these skills and abilities, innate skills and abilities that are cultivated and grown through the practice of mindfulness leads to greater resilience. Resilience is this ability to kind of bounce back from adversity, to survive and even thrive when faced with challenging situations, just like we are now. It'll be interesting to see how we tap into our resilience around this pandemic. So there are external and internal factors that can influence our resilience. And some of these internal factors, I think, are really mitigated by the practice of mindfulness. One of those is your ability to enjoy interpersonal connection and have empathy, have pro-social relationships. This development of awareness of our environment and our inner experience, and curiosity about how our inner experience affects our choices. Our willingness to face discomfort and difficulty. Our ability to be self-compassionate when we make mistakes, when we feel vulnerable. Can we take care of ourselves? Do we shame and blame ourselves? To be optimistic and open to opportunities, and to be adaptive and have self-regulation and coping skills that are healthy when we're exposed to stressors. So resilience, we found in the research, is learnable, and also it's contagious. Resilient communities contain more resilient individuals, and resilient parents tend to raise resilient children. And so this is a big reason why a mindfulness practice can be an important tool in your toolbox. Not only do you benefit from your practice, but also the people around you, including your children, benefit from your practice, even if they're not practicing. Anything you want to say about resilience, Erik?
I would only say, just to piggyback on that, there's a sense, like I said before, I teach a lot of cops and firefighters and soldiers, and there's this sense that we all possess no more or less resilience now than we ever have or ever will. That somehow it's a fixed value, that it can't be learned, let alone be shared with others. And I think really the science and our own intuition really tells us that's not the case. We can learn to grow. We can become more resilient, and not be limited to or anchored to this idea that, well, that's just me. That's just how I deal with stress. That's just how he or she deals with stress. These are learnable skills. Saying I really love by a mindfulness teacher, Joseph Goldstein, is that it's easier to be mindful than it is to remember to be mindful. And so you've heard us use this word practice over and over and over again. And with all the science and all the principles and everything else that there is to know about mindfulness, it still boils down to a practice in order to develop and cultivate these skills we've been talking about.
So how do I get started? Well, there's so many ways. Probably some of you have already started on your own. This seminar that you came to today is a way to start, just developing an understanding, maybe reading some books, maybe downloading a meditation app, practicing guided recordings on SoundCloud or YouTube. But I think one of the most important ways to get started is to find a teacher and a practice community. From teaching mindfulness now for a number of years, I get so many people that come to me and say, oh yeah, I started on my own, I read a book, or I downloaded an app, and then I ran into this difficulty, and they didn't know what to do from there, and they got discouraged and quit. And then luckily somehow they maybe came to one of our practice meetings or something like that. And oftentimes it's just a misunderstanding that they had. We already heard a couple of examples today about this idea that you have to empty your mind, or that you have to sit still and notice your breathing. When this doesn't work for somebody, and when people have ideas about what success is and that's not happening, they can get really discouraged and quit. It reminds me a lot of like people who go to the gym. They might go a little bit and they don't get the results that they want quickly enough and they quit, or maybe they have some kind of discouraging experience. So having a teacher and a community is so important, because you get this feedback and you get this support. And the community is like this motivator. You have these people that are, this is a normal part of their life. Out there in our culture, you know, probably not a lot of people that you're hanging around with are practicing mindfulness. So it's easy to be out of mind. But when you're hanging out on a weekly basis, or however often you meet with people who make this a normal part of their lives, it's easier for you to make it a normal part of your life. And then hearing their experiences and having the support of people to go to when you're having struggles really helps you kind of persevere even when you run into difficulties. We have all kinds of recommendations about what kinds of books and apps and things might be useful. And we do have a number of communities in our area that you could check out. But we won't list those right now because we want to make sure there's a little time for asking questions. Erik, is there anything that you want to say about how to get started?
You know, I would just share what we consider in mindfulness to be a pretty important distinction between setting intentions versus setting goals. So many of us are drawn to mindfulness to get better or to heal. And we tend to set goals and have expectations and wonder how much we can accomplish in so many weeks or months. And that can really be counterproductive. Tracy mentioned the attitudes of mindfulness earlier. One of them is non-striving, which tells us that to the degree that we set these goals and expectations, it can actually give our survival brain, like I talked about earlier, the message that something is actually wrong. So rather than coming from this point of something being wrong with us, this idea that we're setting an intention to cultivate these principles of mindfulness can be a lot more productive and at the end of the day healing than saying, well, I'm going to be this much more calm or this much less anxious by mid-May or something like that, which tends to get us in trouble.